Okay, how do you know if your child needs an IEP? Yours has a 504, but I will tell you, based upon everything you laid out in your scenario, what it sounds like to me is that you have repeated violations of the 504, and that is going to be the reason, from what I can gather, for the issues with regards to grades and some of the other accommodations. And so it doesn't sound like to me, based upon how you laid it out, that she would need an IEP. An IEP is if your child has need of specialized instruction. And that is if there are underlying issues with regards to let's say math. I'll pull up math. Math disability. Like dyscalculia. A specific learning disability in that area. But it doesn't sound like that's the issue. It sounds like, that the 504, if they implemented it correctly and served her in the way that she needed to be served with regards to her accommodations, that she would do fine. And that is always the goal. Now, what do you do about that? Well, you would need to either file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights, and then they would have their team of attorneys come in and investigate. And, as part of the corrective action, you could have, the request made that they not only put in place a good 504 moving forward, but then as far as the remedial or compensatory factor, to have tutoring that the school system would have to fund in order to make up for where they failed her on the accommodation side of her 504. That seems like the most logical. Now, can you also file a 504 complaint? Yes, your school system is going to have a mechanism of the 504 complaint process, and it's going to work very similar to the due process for an IEP. Except the school system, instead of the state providing, I guess it depends on the state that you're in. But let's say Alabama. The school system itself, typically with their internal 504 complaint process, would have to go out and secure an impartial 504 hearing officer, which is typically going to be the same people that hear IDEA, IEP related due process, because the analysis with regards to a free and appropriate public education are very similar. So it only makes sense that in a lot of the states that's who they would use, are the ones that also do the due process determinations for IEPs. Okay. There's nothing that says under 504 that you can't jump your complaint straight into federal court. But at the same time, I can tell you that a school, if they have a 504 complaint process laid out, and you would need to ask your school district, so sometimes it's not necessarily listed on their on their school website, which it should be. But I would find that out. But if you jump straight into federal court, then what I've seen happen is that the school system will come back and say, well, the parent failed to exhaust in our internal 504 complaint process. And I'm not saying a federal judge would, but I would bet that the federal judge would kick it back and say, well, you got to exhaust on this level before you can jump into federal court. And that's why I recommend parents just finding out whether the school system has its own internal 504 complaint process, and use that and respect it if you're deciding not to go the OCR route. There's nothing that necessarily says that you can't do both simultaneously. But with regards to an IEP, it would all be about whether your child needs that specialized instruction. That also, you also get the accommodations with an IEP, but that is the difference. Whether your child has a qualifying disability, and in most states, the majority of states, they recognize the 13 categories recognized by the federal government. They can always add to that, depending on what state you're in, but they can't do less than the 13 categories. So you got to have a qualifying disability in one of those 13, and you have to be in need of specialized instruction. And that's where, according to your scenario, it sounds like a series of repetitive violations on the 504 doesn't necessarily sound like it's a need for an IEP, because it doesn't sound like your daughter necessarily needs the special education aspect. She just needs a bunch of people that get their act together and show compassion and give her the accommodations that she's entitled to.